Hi, I'm Cora Miller, here this afternoon in Mitchellville Freedom Park, and we're going to be reading a story about a little girl named Sweet Clara. Now, Sweet Clara became a seamstress and made freedom quilts. And if you know anything about a quilt, if your grandmother or aunt made one, you know it was something that kept you really warm, and not only being warm, but at the same time, this quilt stitchings led to freedom. It became a map. So here, we'll start our story. Now, the writer of this book was Deborah Hawkinson, and the illustrator was James Ranson. Our story begins. Before I was even 12 years old, I got sent from North Farm to Home Plantation because they needed another field hand. When I got there, I cried so much they thought I was never going to eat or drink again. I didn't want to leave my mama. I'm going back, I whispered every day to young Jack, who worked beside me in the fields. Well, you better start eating all you can, Sweet Clara, he smiled at me. But then his smile was gone. In a low voice, he said, or else you won't make it. Young Jack helped me to believe I'd get back to my mama someday. Truth was, I'd be lost before I could get through those fields, them being so big and tall, but I didn't give up my dream. Aunt Rachel was raising me now. She wasn't my for real blood aunt, but she did her best to care for me. One night, she came back from working in the big house and found me laying flat dead on the cabin floor. She shook her head and said, "Sweet Clara, you ain't gonna last in them fields, but I got an idea." Aunt Rachel's idea was sewing, and she started teaching me the very next night. It wasn't easy for me to learn, my hands already rough and clumsy from hoeing and weeding in the fields. So Aunt Rachel took it very slow. She bought scraps of cloth from the big house and taught me about each one, how it was special, and had it to be treated in its own way. I like to piece the scraps together to make pretty patches of colors. But Aunt Rachel didn't care much about pretty patterns. "Now you rip out all that whole row and do it again, Clara," she said. "Why? I got to make the stitches so tiny," I complained. "You gonna be a seamstress someday." That's what she told her. "Tomorrow, you coming with me to the big house." "I got it all worked out," Aunt Rachel said one day. I was frightened. "You ready to sew with me?" she went on. "Miss'm daughter, Ella, be getting married come spring. I told Miss'm I'd be helping out, and I'd need help. She looked your work with sharp eyes, Clara. So do it quick and neat like I taught you." Next morning, I tried to eat some cornbread, but my insides were all knotted up. I'd never been inside the big house before or seen white people that close, except the overseer. The morning sun was streaming into the sewing room, turning everything all sunflower yellow. Aunt Rachel gave me some sheets to hem. Instead of being contrary, the needle did all I wanted, just like being a part of my hand. At the end of the day, Mrs. came in. "Let me see your work, Clara," she said. I gave her the sheet, and she ran it through her hands real slow. I held my breath watching. "From now on, come here," she said at last. When she left, Aunt Rachel and I looked at each other, about ready to burst. "We did it, girl," she cried. So as I changed from field hand to seamstress, since the sewing room was right off from the kitchen, Aunt Rachel and I were near the cook and helpers. There was always lots of bustle and company in the kitchen. I was hearing about all kinds of new places and things. I listened so hard it felt like my ears must be growing right out of my head and getting big with listening. One day, 2 white men came to see the master. The driver went into the kitchen to talk to cook. "There's been too many runaways last summer," one of the drivers said. "They going around asking all the masters in the county to join the patrols." "Crazy running away, muttered Cook as she kept beating up some batter. "Where you gonna get to, except lost in the swamp?" "Dummy," said the other. "But I hear we ain't that far from the Ohio River. Once you get that far, the Underground Railroad will carry you across." "That's right," agreed another one. "The railroad will get you all the way to Canada. Then you'll be free forever." Cook snorted. If it be that easy, as you let on to be, many more would have gone." One of the men replied in a quiet voice, "It'd be easy if we had a map." Walking back from the big house that evening, I asked Aunt Rachel about what I'd heard. "Where's Canada? And what's the Underground Railroad?" "See there?" Aunt Rachel pointed. "That's the North Star. Under that star, far up north, is Canada. The Underground Railroad is people who've been helping folks get there, secret like." She looked at me hard. "But don't you start thinking about that. You run away and get caught, you'll be beaten." Still, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Next day, I asked Cook, "Those 2 white men that were here yesterday, they was talking about a map. What's a map?" "Just a picture on the land, that's all. Whatever's on the ground, a map can have it." Sunday, I went to my favorite place on the little hill and looked out at the people's cabins and the fields. I took a stick and started making a picture in the dirt of all I could see. But how could I make a picture of things far away that I couldn't see? And how could I make a map that wouldn't be washed away by the rain? A map that would show the way to freedom. Then one day I was sewing a patch on a pretty blue blanket. The patch looked just like some shapes as the cows pond near the cabins. The little stitches looked like a path going around it. Here it was, a picture that wouldn't wash away, a map. So I started a quilt. When you sewing, no matter how carefully you be, little scraps of cloth always be left after you cut out a dress or a pillowcase. So while my ears kept listening and my hands kept sewing, I began to squirrel away little pieces of cloth. When we were off work, I went to visit people in the quarters. I started asking what fields were. Then I started pinching the scraps of cloth with the scraps of things I was learning. Aunt Rachel said, "Sweet Clara, what kind of pattern you making in that quilt?" "Ain't no pattern I ever seen." "I don't know, Aunt Rachel. I'm just patching it together as I go." She looked at me long, but then she just nodded. She knew what she was up to. There was a buzzing in the quarters one summer evening. I saw the patrols and I knew someone had ran away. It was young Jack. But 5 days later, they caught him. That next Sunday, I went to see him, and we walked to the top of the little hill. He didn't smile the way he used to. I took a stick and began to draw in the dirt. I drew a little square for the big house, a line of boxes for the cabins of the quarters, and some bigger squares for the fields east of the big house. I drew as much as I had pieced together. Jack sat beside me, not saying anything, not even looking at first. Then he started seeing what I was doing. I handed the stick to him. I heard him catch his breath up quick. Then he began to draw. I worked on the quilt for a long time. Sometimes months would go by and I wouldn't get a piece to sew in. Sometimes I had to wait to get the right kind of cloth. I had blue calico and flowered blue silk for creeks and rivers, and green and blue greens for the fields, and white sheeting for roads. Mrs. liked to wear pink a lot. So big house, the quarters, and finally the big house at North Farm, they were all in pink. The quilt got bigger and bigger, and if folks knew what I was doing, no one said. But they came by the sewing room to pass the time of day whenever they could. "By the way, Clara," a driver might tell me, "I heard the master saying yesterday he didn't want to travel to Mr. Moe's place because it's over 20 miles north of here." Or someone would sit eating cook's food and say, "So I could hear word is they gonna plant corn in them 3 west fields on the Verona plantation this year." When the master went out hunting, Cook's husband was the guide. He came back and said, "That swamp next to the house plantation is a nasty place. But listen, Clara, and I'll tell you how I threaded my way in and out of there as smooth as your needle is in that cloth." He was directing her with that needle. Then, one night, the quilt was done. I looked at it all spread out in the dim light of the cabin. Aunt Rachel studied it for the longest time. She touched the stitches lightly, her fingers moving slowly over the last pieces I'd added, a hidden boat that would carry us across the Ohio River. Finally, they came to rest on the bright star at the top. She tried to make her voice cheery. "You always did like to make patterns and pictures, Clara. You get married to young Jack one of these days, and you two will have a real nice quilt to sleep under." "Aunt Rachel, I couldn't sleep under this quilt," I answered softly, putting my hand over hers. "Wouldn't be restful, somehow. Anyway, I think it should stay here. Maybe others can use it." Aunt Rachel sighed But ain't you gonna need the quilt where you going? I kissed her. Don't worry, Aunt Rachel. I got memories of all of it in my head. It rained hard for 3 days next week. Me and Jack left home plantation in a dark thunderstorm. The day after, it was so stormy to work in the fields, so Jack wasn't missed. And Aunt Rachel told them I was sick. We went north, following the trail of the Freedom Quilt. All the things people told me about, all the tiny stitchings I took, now I could see real things. There was the old tree stump down struck by lightning, the winding road near the creek, the hunting path through the swamp. It was like being in a dream you had already dreamed. Mostly, we hid during the day and walked at night. When we got to the North Farm, Jack slipped in through the darkness to find what cabin my mama was in. Then we went in to get her and find a little sister I didn't even know I had. Mama was so surprised. "Sweet Clara," she said, "you grown so big." Her eyes just like I remembered, her arms strong around me. "Mama, I'm here for you. We going north. We know the way." I was frightened they wouldn't come, but then Mama said yes. Young Jack carried my sister Annie, and I held on to Mama's hands. We kept on as fast as we could, skirting farms and towns and making our way through the woods. At last, one clear dark night, we came to the Ohio River. The river was high, but I remembered the place on the quilt where I'd marked the crossing. We searched the bushes along the banks until at last we found the little boat. "This was hidden here for the folks in the Underground Railroad," I said. The boat carried us across the dark, deep water to the other side. Shivering and hungry and scared, we stood looking ahead. "Which way now?" Jack asked. I pointed. The North Star was shining clear above us. Up there, through the woods, north to Canada. Sometimes I think back to the night we left, when young Jack came to wake me. I could still see Aunt Rachel sitting up in her bed. She just shook her head before I could say a word. "Before you go, just cover me with your quilt, sweet Clara," she said. "I'm too old to walk, but not too old to dream. And maybe I can help others follow the quilt to freedom." Now see, with this story and being here in Mitchellville, being the first self-governed free man's town, before the emancipation was even written. So Mitchellville is a place where people had homes and they worked and they raised their own food. There's a store here also where they could trade and sell. Quilts were used for covering to keep persons warm, but also to give signs for freedom and the trail to freedom going up north. See, when these quilts would hang out on the line, people knew to just read the stitchings, what sweet Clara had started. And the ladies sewed the quilts and taught generations and generations to sew quilts, so then they too could be warm with their families, but also to find their way to freedom. Thank you for visiting with us today, and we hope you enjoyed the book. Sweet Clara, and the Freedom Quilt.